Prepare to have your mind blown. Mississippi is safer than Texas, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Find out where the Magnolia State landed and much more as we look into how dangerous every state is. We've got the data straight from the crime reports, and it's not looking pretty for some of these states. From peaceful lobster towns in Maine to full-on chaos in Washington, D.C., we're ranking all 50 states plus the capital from the safest ones to the ones where you might want to sleep with one eye open, a security system, and a dog named Crusher who doesn't like anyone. Got it? Get it? Good. Let's take a look. 51. District of Columbia. Washington, D.C. may be where laws are made, but it's also where they're broken, frequently. With over 800 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents, the nation's capital leads the pack in crime. Between political tension, wealth inequality, and city sprawl, it's a hot spot for muggings, believe it or not, carjackings, and overall chaos. It's like the House of Cards, but with more actual stabbings, and less stabbing in the back, which they have plenty of that. The District of Columbia sees about 812 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 50. New Mexico. New Mexico's stunning desert landscapes can't distract you from the second place trophy for violence. Albuquerque alone skews the numbers, with gang activities, drug-related crime, and police staffing shortages making headlines. It's the land of enchantment and, unfortunately, emergency rooms. New Mexico sees about 780 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 49. Alaska. Alaska may look like a peaceful postcard, but it's got one of the highest violent crime rates in the country. Isolation, limited law enforcement, and high rates of domestic violence and substance abuse make it a rough place to live, especially in remote villages where help is hours away. Or not at all. But they definitely got cold and stunning views. Safe neighborhoods? Not so much. Alaska sees about 759 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 48. Arkansas. Arkansas brings southern hospitality with a twist of danger. Little Rock has had violent crime issues for decades. Poverty, lack of access to education, and struggling healthcare systems all keep Arkansas planted firmly in the danger zone. And Little Rock's not even their most violent city. That goes to Pine Bluff, which sometimes shows up in the top 5 for the country in violent crime. It's the kind of place you move to if, let's say, you want to push your own off button, but you're too chicken to do it on your own. You just move to Pine Bluff and keep walking to the corner store every day a couple times. Arkansas sees 645 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 47. Louisiana. If you want good food and jazz, Louisiana's your place. If you want to avoid armed robbery, maybe not. New Orleans is charming, but it also has one of the highest murder rates in the country for years. Mix in economic inequality, sprinkle in a little disaster, and you've got the perfect storm of suckage. Suckage always leads to violence. But it's not the worst. Louisiana has about 629 violent crimes per every 100,000 residents. Getting better. 46. Tennessee. Nashville is booming and Memphis is still Memphis. The volunteer state is beautiful, sure, but it also battles high crime rates year after year. A combination of gang violence, drug trafficking, and low police morale keep them on the list. And if you don't know, Memphis is one of the most dangerous cities in the United States. You haven't been paying attention, and it sort of brings down the entire state. Now, they're not the absolute worst, and most of the state is relatively safe. Just Memphis is horrible. There are 622 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents in Tennessee. 45. California. Despite what Instagram tells you, California isn't just palm trees, Teslas, and beautiful beaches with beautiful women on them. With cities like Oakland, Los Angeles, and San Bernardino facing serious crime issues, the Golden State has a not-so-golden violent crime rate. California sees 499 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Number 44, Colorado. Now, a lot of people think Colorado legalized a plant and also it accidentally legalized some chaos. It's not true. Their drug-related crimes are down, but the cost of living and a few other factors have kind of put people in a bad situation. And when people get put in bad situations, they start committing crimes. Now, that's just the average Joe. Criminals are going to be criminals no matter what you do, and every town's got them, every city's got them. But when you look at Denver and Colorado Springs, they've seen a surge in homelessness and assaults. Mental health and the housing crisis don't really help the situation. Colorado sees about 492 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 43, South Carolina. Southern charm only gets you so far. From Columbia to Charleston, South Carolina's violent crime rate stays stubbornly high. Mixed poverty and poor social services, and you've got some rough times ahead. And bad stats. South Carolina sees about 491 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 42, Missouri. St. Louis is a frequent flyer on the most dangerous cities in America list. High murder rates and economic inequality keep Missouri firmly in the red zone. I've always found St. Louis's situation tragic because, everyone's going to have some crime, but this is such a historic city, especially when you consider the move west. They need to get it together. But with Missouri and a couple other places like we talked about Arkansas earlier, it's not just the big city of St. Louis. They've got a bunch of other smaller cities and towns that have pretty high violent crime rates. A lot of it, though, in the smaller towns has to do with domestic violence. Missouri sees 488 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 41, Michigan. Detroit is rebuilding, but it's not crime-free. Michigan also struggles in places like Flint and Saginaw, where poverty remains high and opportunities are limited. When people don't have opportunities, they start doing stupid stuff. And when people are broke and struggling, they tend to commit domestic violence as well. Michigan sees 461 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 40, Nevada. Vegas brings the glam, but also the grit. Between transient populations, substance abuse, and underfunded police force, Nevada is more than slot machines, giant orbs, and memories of buffet lines. They don't have many buffets in Vegas anymore. Remember that? That was all the rage. Everyone would go to the buffet. It was great. Nevada sees 454 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 39, Texas. With more than 29 million people, Texas has plenty of everything, including crime. Cities like Houston and Dallas drag up the numbers, while rural areas see spikes from drug-related violence and domestic disputes. Yeah, as hard as it is to believe, Texas is not perfect. It's got some problems. It's almost in the top 10 for most violent states. Texas sees 432 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 38, Arizona. Hot, dry, and feisty. Phoenix and Tucson contribute heavily to Arizona's stats. Border issues, gang violence, and economic disparity all play their part. As the cities like Phoenix grow, more people means more problems. That's all there is to it. And as much as I hate to admit it, big cities need a ridiculous amount of police and resources. They really need to look at the population density numbers, not just the overall population. Arizona sees 431 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. New York. New York used to top these charts back in the 80s and 90s. While things have improved, New York and upstate cities like Rochester and Buffalo still deal with high levels of violence. New York sees about 429 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 36, Oklahoma. Oklahoma has struggled with gang-related violence and drug trafficking for decades. Whatever the latest drug is, they're having to deal with it. Tulsa and Oklahoma City tend to dominate the crime conversations in Oklahoma, but they've got a lot of rural areas and small towns that have an overabundance of crime. Oklahoma sees about 420 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 35, Montana. Big Sky Country has big crime problems, especially for a low population state. Domestic violence and alcohol-related abuse are major issues in many rural areas. Now, they don't have a lot of people, so a really bad weekend can really change their stats. But right now, they see about 418 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents a year. 34, Kansas. Kansas City, Kansas, always in the shadow of its Missouri sibling, carries a surprising chunk of the state's crime. A lack of funding for law enforcement and economic stagnation doesn't help. Kansas sees about 415 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 33, Alabama. Alabama's mix of urban poverty and rural decay makes it a breeding ground for violent crime. Birmingham and Montgomery often rank poorly in safety metrics, and it's just getting worse. Alabama sees about 409 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 32, North Carolina. North Carolina is growing fast, but so are the crime stats. Charlotte and Fayetteville report high incidents of assaults, robberies, and domestic violence. Domestic violence has always been a real problem in the Fayetteville area. I lived out there for a brief time. They had all kind of postings on the different walls and barracks and stuff like that reminded you it's not okay to rough up family members. North Carolina sees about 405 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 31, Maryland. Baltimore alone is enough to put Maryland on this list. With staggering homicide rates and community police tension, the city has long struggled to regain control. Maryland sees about 398 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. They'd probably have more, but their rural areas are pretty nice. 30, Delaware. Surprisingly high for a small state. Delaware's violent crime is mainly centered around Wilmington, much like Maryland with Baltimore. It's got big city problems in a pint-sized package. Delaware sees about 384 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 29, South Dakota. Low population, high violence, native reservations and rural areas suffer from domestic disputes, substance abuse, and low police coverage. That's like the ingredients for a crime smoothie right there. South Dakota sees 377 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 28, Washington. Seattle's rising homelessness and drug issues have fueled a jump in violent crime. Spokane's not helping, and either is Tacoma. That being said, they're almost middle of the road, with 340 being considered the midway point on this list. Now, 3 years ago, Washington did have a little over 400 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. So right now they're doing pretty good because it's gone down. They only have 376 for every 100,000 residents. 27, Georgia. Atlanta has a booming economy and a booming crime rate in some areas. Now, they have been getting better, but they still got it. Right now, they're dealing with their rural counties, got some serious drug problems, and that's creating more violent crime. But overall, they're almost middle of the road. Georgia sees 367 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Number 26, Oregon. You know, if it wasn't for Portland, they'd be doing a lot better. Portland's crime rate has spiked in recent years amid social unrest and a rise in homelessness. Now, homelessness is going down a little bit, but it's still up there. Oregon's urban and rural divide is growing, and it shows in the stats. If you were to take Portland out of this equation, their numbers would be closer to 210 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. But right now, their violent crime rate is 342 for every 100,000 residents. 25, Massachusetts. Boston's a lot safer than it used to be, but cities like Springfield and Brockton keep the state's average above where you'd expect it. But compared to some of the states we've already seen, 322 for every 100,000 residents is not that bad. 24, Indiana. Indianapolis pulls a lot of the weight here, with South Bend not helping matters. Gun violence and gang activity continue to plague the state's capital. But you go out to the rural areas, and they're not doing terrible. There are some states that have rural areas that are just awash with crime. Indiana's not nearly as bad. They see 306 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 23, Wisconsin. Milwaukee's ongoing struggle with segregation, poverty, and gun crimes raised Wisconsin's average significantly. The rest of the state, pretty mellow. That's why they only see 297 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Now, did a video like this some years back where I mentioned how low something was, and they had something around 280 violent crimes. And of course, I got a bunch of comments. Oh, you seem to think that's okay? They have violent crime. Yes, every place in the world has violent crime. If you think that it's bad because they have any violent crimes, great, it is, but that's not the reality of the world. 22, Ohio. Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Dayton keep Ohio's crime rate higher than you'd hope. Rust Belt state decline hasn't helped over the years, but they're not that bad. I mean, they're better than half the country. Ohio only sees around 294 violent crimes per every 100,000 residents. 21, Iowa. Iowa doesn't really have a lot of crime, but cities like Des Moines and Cedar Rapids still face issues with assaults and drug-related incidents. But compared to most of the states, it's not that bad. They only have 287 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 20, Illinois. Chicago's reputation precedes it, but crime isn't exclusive to the Windy City. Smaller towns across the state feel a little of that heat too, but nothing compared to most states. You got to keep in mind, Chicago is one big city in the middle of a large state. They do have some places like Rockford and Southside Chicago, but the rest of the state is doing pretty good when it comes to crime. Like I've discussed in other videos, Chicago has a lot of violent crime and a lot of crime in general, but they have like 3 million people in the city itself, and then the metro area has over 9 million. So that brings their rate way down. Overall, Illinois only sees about 287 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. I know that's going to be hard for a lot of you to accept. It's just math. 19, Nebraska. Lincoln and Omaha have seen gradual increases in violence, but nothing horrible. This is more a case of small spikes standing out in a very quiet state. I mean, look at any newspaper there. The biggest news flashes they have are about road construction, maybe a drunk driver here or there, but most of it's taken up by obituaries, and that's a good thing. Sure, horrible when people die, but it happens. And it's all older people passed away. Pick any town in Nebraska. It's real nice, boring news. Nebraska sees about 283 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Number 18, Minnesota. Minneapolis saw a huge jump in crime post-2020. Protests, police shortages, and rising tensions haven't helped Minnesota's stats. But we're getting kind of away from that 5 years later, and they're sort of back to normal. Minnesota sees about 281 violent crimes every year for every 100,000 residents. 17, North Dakota. Who would have seen this one coming? North Dakota's doing better than South Dakota. Why is this? They're both about the same size. They have very similar populations. It is a little colder in North Dakota, and there's fewer crimes committed in cold climates. I'm sure there's a lot of factors, but one that I kind of key in on is tourism. South Dakota sees a lot more people coming to it, and even though they're not residents, their crime goes on the stats as it happened in the state, which when we compare how crime rates are, it's against the population. That's not the whole story. It's just a small part that I think is often overlooked. One other one, there's some small towns in California that have really high crime rates, but not that many people. I thought it was strange. I did a little digging, found out it's because they got a prison near the town, and the crimes that happen in the prison actually count against the town. Weird. But North Dakota sees about 280 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 16, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia is dragging the state down here. Gun violence and poverty dominate certain neighborhoods, while rural areas are relatively peaceful. Pennsylvania sees about 280 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 15, West Virginia. Now, this one's a little strange because we all hear that, West Virginia is just horrible. I mean, it's got the worst poverty. The opioid crisis hit this state hard. And that's sort of where the problem is when it comes to their stats. They don't have a lot of violent crime. They have a lot of drug-related crime. That doesn't bring a lot of violent crime with it, which in most cases it does. Most of their violent crime that they do have comes from domestic violence. West Virginia sees about 278 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 14, Hawaii. You can't surf your way out of this one. Honolulu's seen rises in assaults and property crime. Paradise, mostly. Honolulu, it's got some problems. But overall, the state has a really low violent crime rate. I'm sure if you could arrest someone for assaulting your eyes by wearing a Speedo and black socks at the beach, those tourists would be killing their stats. But Hawaii only sees about 260 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. 13, Florida. Florida man may be entertaining, but he's also dangerous. From Miami to Jacksonville, crime stays spicy in the Sunshine State, but they're not that bad. It's a big state. Miami and Jacksonville can only drag them down so far. Florida only sees about 259 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Part of that has to do with the large retiree population. They're not out beating people up or killing each other over bingo card exaggerations or something. Number 12, Mississippi. This is what I talked about in the beginning. This should blow a lot of people's minds. They've got high poverty, low education, and an underfunded police force. A lot of their crimes are property and drug related. Not a lot of violence here either. They do have it. It's just not nearly as bad as you'd think it would be. I mean, again, poverty, underfunded police, that just smacks of violent crime gonna happen. No, not here. Mississippi only sees about 245 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Number 11, Utah. Utah is generally calm, but Salt Lake City's urban issues have pushed the state a little bit higher than expected on this list. But overall, the state is quiet. They only see about 242 violent crimes every year for every 100,000 residents. Number 10, Idaho. Not much happening here, which is great for your safety. Still, even Idaho does get the occasional flare-up of domestic violence, which is never a good thing. Idaho only sees about 241 violent crimes a year per every 100,000 residents. Number 9, Virginia. Virginia holds it together pretty good. With crimes mainly concentrated in cities like Richmond and Norfolk, the rural parts of Virginia are pretty mellow, and that helps keep their average down. Virginia sees about 234 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Number 8, Connecticut. Despite being sandwiched between New York City and Boston, Connecticut keeps crime levels in check. Just don't go wandering too far into Bridgeport or Hartford and you'll be fine. Like we mentioned in other videos, Connecticut's got some of the wealthiest neighborhoods and small towns in the country, and when you have that, you don't have a lot of crime. Connecticut only sees about 222 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Number 7, Kentucky. Who else's mouth just hit the floor? They still have some issues in cities like Louisville, but overall, it's a mellow state for crime, past the bourbon. And Louisville's crime rate is really not that bad compared to other good-sized cities. Kentucky only sees about 214 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents every year. Number 6, New Jersey. Again, surprise, surprise, how did they get here? Well, most of New Jersey's pretty nice. You just got a few cities that should be avoided at all costs. New Jersey just gets a bad rap and their crime stats tell a different story. Camden's cleaned up its act, it's nowhere near where it should be, and Newark's not what it used to be either. Both have done a great job cleaning up their violent crime, but they're still got a long ways to go. Camden has a whole bunch of crime, but not as much violent crime as they used to have. New Jersey sees about 203 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Number 5, Wyoming. If you're not cattle, you're probably safe. With so few people, it's hard to find someone to mug. Most of their violent crime has to do with bar fights and stupid stuff like that, and I'm sure a lot of domestic violence. But since there's not that many people, you really don't hear about it much. Wyoming only sees about 202 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Number 4, Rhode Island. In case you're wondering, the rest of this list is New England. But Rhode Island is small, wealthy, and relatively calm. Even Providence has cleaned up its act a bit. It's really the only place they needed to clean up. Rhode Island sees about 172 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Number 3, Vermont. Low population, high moose to human ratio, and little reason to commit crime. Vermont's living the good life. The only place you're going to find any real crime is Burlington, and most of that has to do with the homeless population that's kind of grown there. The rest of the state, calm. Vermont sees about 150 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. Number 2, New Hampshire. This is the kind of place where violent crime might mean a heated town meeting. Peaceful, quiet, and very, very respectful of each other. New Hampshire only sees about 126 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. All right, before we get to number 1, if you have not subscribed to this channel and you would like to see more of our content, you could hit that subscribe button and don't forget to hit that bell notification so you know when we upload. All right, on to number 1. And number 1, Maine. Yeah, I'm sure most of you saw this coming. Congratulations, Maine. You win the safest state in America award. Just lobsters, lighthouses, and nobody bothering anyone. I was in Maine last September. It was great. The only real crime I saw was a girl wearing 2 different colored Crocs. That was kind of strange. I don't know if that'd fall under violent crime, but I'm sure if you're some kind of New York fashion designer, you would have lost your mind seeing that. Maine doesn't have any violent crime. They don't. I mean, it's always 1 or 2 on the safest states list. The top 3 are always in the top 3. Sometimes they change position. Vermont might be number 2 next year. New Hampshire might be number 1. Maine will drop down to number 2. Who knows? It's all the same 3 at the top. Maine only sees about 103 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents. That is excellent, especially when you compare it to how we started this list off with 812 for every 100,000 residents. Bravo, Maine, you're keeping it together. All right, that's today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you got some information out of it. Now go out, have a great day, be nice to each other.